the efficiency at which energy is utilized from the reserves is 82% compared to 72% from the diet. So it's a big difference. And we come into part 2, into some applied nutrition. When we get into protein sources, when we get into protein requirements and intensively managed animals, you have to use the protein concentrates. All these protein concentrates are in use and available in the market. And you can use liquid diet. Liquid diet, a molasses and urea-based diet. You can use it in the animal and the camel nutrition. And this is a nice recipe for liquid diet. You can make it yourself and use it. So the risk in using high urea diet is developing urea toxicity. And urea toxicity basically is alkalosis in the blood. So if you have low level of ammonia, you don't have a problem. But if you have large level of ammonia in the rumen, which comes from high dose of urea or highly fermentable nitrogen in the diet, you develop urea toxicity. There are several attempts, several ways, approaches to reduce the risk of urea toxicity, but what we would like to do, use a good management instead of all these things. So looking at the system, when you have a fermentation process, protein, degraded protein, will be broken down into peptides, into amino acid, into ammonia. At the same time, you have hydrogen produced from the fermentation of other nutrients. Okay? When you remove the nitrogen from an amino acid, you still have a carbon skeleton that you deal with, and will be dealt with very much like any other carbohydrate source in the rumen or in the foregut of the camel, and you produce hydrogen. If ammonia is very high, it leads into depletion of hydrogen in the foregut. And depletion of hydrogen will leave a lot of the ammonia in form NH3, not NH4. The absorption of NH3 is much faster than NH4. So less time is allowed for the microorganism to utilize ammonia and to produce microbial protein. So what happens? Ammonia absorbed into the blood. In the blood, they charge the molecules. So what they do, they capture hydrogen from the blood, and the blood is very got very narrow margin for pH. It's 7.3 to 7.4. Not much to maneuver. So capturing the hydrogen lead into alkalosis. And that's what you have. Farmers always advised to keep a bit of vinegar in the farm. So when you have a problem like this, you drench the animal with vinegar, you're supplying so much hydrogen. Hydrogen will convert NH3 to NH4, more stable and more slower, and utilized by the microbial community. So if we take this carbohydrates converted to volatile fatty acid, just to say where the hydrogen coming from, we will look at a scenario like this. So a scenario like this, you have camels and cattle, you have a vast number of microbial population and diverse microbial population in the foregut. And this is a beautiful photo we developed with a fluorescence dye for microbes. All the green ones are very much like cellulotic bacteria, so that's under normal feeding conditions. When we say normal feeding conditions, animals are eating diets high in fiber. That's what the animal evolved to do. They are herbivores. They not evolved to digest starch and the protein concentrate. They are evolved with the digestive system fully equipped and most suited for high fiber diets. So what it produces, the fermentation processes, produces volatile fatty acid and carbon dioxide, hydrogen. Hydrogen can go into either into methane over there in a process called methanogenesis, that's by the archaeal population, or go into acetate in a process called acetogenesis by acetic bacteria. So acetogenic bacteria here and archaea over here fight for the hydrogen and reduce carbon dioxide to produce methane. Okay, to understand the process and why methanogenesis is more efficient than acetogenesis, the animal, newly born calves, they have very active acetogenic bacterial population, but with advancing maturity and when the rumen become functionally ruminants, digestive system or processes, they lose that capacity and methanogenesis takes over. So this is interesting. To understand that, why do the microorganisms produce methane? They don't do it for fun. They produce methane to get some energy. So making one methane molecule will help them to generate one ATP. So that's what they need. And if you look at the two pathways, they both thermodynamically favorable, but methanogenesis is higher than acetogenesis. So probably the reason why it is going that way is because of the thermodynamics, because all processes has to comply with the laws of thermodynamics. And when we talk about feeding high energy diet, we can use lots of grains, lots of minerals, sources, vitamins, and we encounter acidosis. Acidosis in camels is no different in principles than acidosis in cattle. You feed the animal high starch diet, and that leads into buildup of lactic acid in the stomach. So we identified the bacteria involved in the camel in the development of acidosis, and this is the most aggressive bacterium, Streptococcus bovis, responsible for the development of lactic acid. Other bacteria are involved, but not as aggressive as Streptococcus bovis. What we have, I'll show you some of the beautiful figures that we got. This is nice with the dark sort of. This is using fluorescence in situ hybridization technique, labeling bacteria with a fluorescence dye that emits under fluorescence microscope. And we targeted cellulotic bacteria, the green, Streptococcus bovis, and Lactobacillus species. These data from horses, but the same scenario occurs in camels. So just quickly, that's 0 time before giving high fermentable carbohydrates. Then this is 2 hours after that. You see how the Streptococcus bovis is taking over. And at 4 hours, Streptococcus bovis becomes the predominant bacteria. Then at 24 hours, lactic acid bacteria start to appear. One thing to remember, there are very few true lactic acid bacteria in the foregut of the camel or the rumen of cattle, although it's been reported in books. But we don't really find the true lactic acid bacteria, lactobacilli. What we find, Lactobacillus vitulinus, and when you do the taxonomy based on the 16S RNA, the closest related microorganism to that one is a Clostridial bacteria. But because of the extreme nature of Clostridial bacteria, we cannot classify it like that. So we still call it lactic acid and Lactobacillus vitulinus. So this is the scenario. Same occurs. We managed to isolate some useful bacteria from the camel. Bacteria that utilizes lactic acid and convert lactic acid into propionate, a useful product. This is one of my bacteria, and recently we did the genome on this bacteria. We have lots of information on this particular bacterial species, and we're developing this into a commercial product. What does this do? This is magnified 65,000 times. It's a crescent-shaped bacteria, flagellated. It has a very fascinating biochemical machinery. It starts producing L-lactate, then shift into D-lactate, and when run out of substrate, convert lactate into propionate. So that's what it does. And it can convert 96% of the lactate to propionic acid. So, 1 minute. Thank you very much. So we can, based on the fermentability of grains, we can rank the grains. And this is a beautiful set of data developed by Simon Baird at the University of New England. Simon Baird was in charge of the grain part of a project. I was in charge of the microbiology part of the project. But it's not all grains the same. You have to understand that when you select a grain for high fermentability, you unavoidably increase lactic acid buildup. And what you have to understand what's the fermentability of the starch and what's the enzymatic digestibility. That will allow you to select for the best type of grain to feed your animal. What you would like to see, if it is not fermented, it's still digestible in the intestine. And if it is fermented, the slower the better. So provide volatile fatty acids and provide energy for the microbial population to act. And give you this old trial. When you feed, for example, sorghum, a dry rolled sorghum, 25% of the sorghum starch will be in the feces. When you feed a dry rolled barley, 4%, simply because it's highly fermentable. So for a grain like sorghum, it needs a processing. But for barley, you don't need to process it. So that's adding additional cost without too much benefit. So it's important. With co-grazing, some people ask, so I have to cover this very quickly. Co-grazing cattle with camels, it's very important. What we discovered, after releasing a report by MLA saying there is benefit from co-grazing and cattle perform better, we wanted to investigate that. I had a smart PhD students who wanted to take the challenge, and we looked at co-grazing. And the first thing came to my mind as a gut microbiologist, the transfer of microorganisms from camel to cattle, because the digestion is carried out by microorganisms. When you feed the cattle or feed the camel, you are feeding the microorganism in the foregut. So the first thing came to my mind is the transfer of microorganisms that help cattle to do better. And cattle that is co-grazed with camels performed better, and the digestibility improved by about 6 units. That's very high improvement. The interesting thing, you see butyrate is very high, and we can explain that because we know what raises the butyrate in camel. Butyrovibrio fibrosolvans is a predominant bacterium in the camel, and it produces a butyrate. So there must have been a transfer of butyrovibrio fibro solvents into the cattle, and that's why you have higher level. This is very interesting. Also, you need to be really careful when putting camels with cattle together. This is monensin toxicity. You know monensin. They soften it a bit and they say ionophore. They don't say antibiotics. It's an antibiotic. It works on the exchange of minerals across the membranes, and it's a coccidiostat and also an enhancing growth additive. So camels are very sensitive to monensin. It's a killer to camels. So don't feed them diet containing monensin. This is what happens, you know, edema. You get accumulation of water, fluids, and that's what happens. One other thing, we had an incident in Saudi Arabia. Probably Bernard can tell us a lot about it. He was in the region at that time. 6,000 camels died in mycotoxicity. And they identified some of the toxins responsible for that. So this is a big loss. So you got to be really careful when feeding your camels, choosing a clean diet for the camel. Parasites, this is not my area of expertise. I leave it to the expert, and I'm sure going to be covered well. Then, when I was trying to lose a bit of weight, it's a good idea to share your breakfast with the camel. And thank you very much. And